What is a spontaneous painting? Well, it's a painting that doesn't have a plan and it's spontaneous. So as you're painting it, it kind of reveals itself to you. So today in this video, we're going to talk about my tips and tricks for painting your own spontaneous paintings and how I painted this one. So let's get started. First, I'm using Baohong watercolor paper. It's cold press. You need a really nice quality paper because we're going to be using a lot of water and manipulating the paint. So I suggest something like this for spontaneous paintings. I have a limited palette with cad yellow, quin magenta, cerulean, indigo, sap green, and then I also have a little half pan of cad orange because I really want a nice bright orange for the fall colors that we're going to be using. I'm starting with my flat brush to do a wash of clean water on the paper, and you can see my strokes are kind of erratic. I'm not painting the entire thing. I'm doing just very random wispy strokes in clean water to start. Now I want to start tapping in some of my colors into the clean water. I like the way it looks when you have some hard lines and some really blurred lines, so I was trying to have a mixture of that throughout this painting. That's also one of my tips. Let the watercolor tell you what is coming. So as I tap these shapes and these colors into the watery parts, I'm starting to get a feel for what this landscape is. For example, I kind of know that I want trees in my landscape, even though it's not planned out. I kind of know I already want like a fall feeling with foliage. So I'm doing kind of tree type shapes, but I'm letting the watercolor flow into the watery areas and tell me how tall the trees are, what shape they are, and mixing the colors on my palette, especially because I'm using a limited palette, it will really help guide me to what the next color is, if that makes sense. Another thing is to keep in mind that you don't want these faraway areas in the back of this spontaneous landscape to look really flat on one plane. The best way to do that is to use lighter colors that blend more into the watery areas to look mistier and lighter. They will look farther away, and then you can put some of your brighter, more concentrated, saturated colors towards the front of that horizon line, if that makes sense. So that's one of the ways you can spontaneously paint but still maintain perspective. When you are doing this type of painting, you do need to move relatively quickly, but I want you to let go of the idea that it has to be really anything. The idea of a spontaneous landscape is you kind of drop the colors in and you let the water that you've put on the paper tell you what's happening. So I had no idea what I wanted except that I knew there was going to be trees, and I just played around with adding shapes, adding color, adding contrast, jumping around while everything is still wet because I did not want it to start drying before I was able to get the initial very blurred, flowy colors into this landscape. One of my favorite tricks is using the other end of my brush to slightly push into the paper, creating an indent that the watercolor flows into and creates a slightly darker line. This can be used for tree trunks, branches, stems, leaves, grass, pretty much anything in the natural world, and I absolutely love it, especially for spontaneous paintings because it does not look overworked and it will be a lot lighter and more subtle than maybe adding stems and branches yourself by painting it in. At this point in the painting, I could see a path. So based on the shapes that I was starting to paint, there was enough space that I stepped back and I could see this little zigzag path. So I rinsed my brush, I tapped it on the paper towel, and I used a clean brush to pick up the paint that is in that zigzag that I could see, and also use some of that pigment to help define and create a boundary for that path. So one of the most important parts of painting a spontaneous landscape is not filling the entire thing with watercolor, but leaving some open gaps, doing different levels of pigment and water so that you have the opportunity to see something like a path, or I'm not sure, anything that you want to add in your painting, and then just let your painting tell you what wants to be there. So once I saw the path, I knew that's the direction I wanted to go, and I pretty much used color and shape to define the path throughout the rest of the painting, because as everything is starting to dry, I am able to add more color that gets less diffused out into the water, but will stay and help me define and create more shapes. So you'll see that as I'm adding more and more paint, it looks more detailed and less chaotic. So that is the next step in a spontaneous painting, is now that the watercolor and the water have kind of made this landscape for you. I've got the trees in the background, I've got a path that is beginning to take form. I am able to define those features now to actually make a landscape. So the spontaneous part is that I had no plan going in, but it's not necessarily spontaneous the entire time, if that makes sense. You can use the spontaneity of watercolor to give you those first initial layers, and then as everything starts to dry, define and add and layer as much as you want to. So it was very important that this path start to take shape. So I used some rusty red color and tried to define some of the edges so that it wasn't just this misty, weird blob in the middle of the painting. But even just those 3 strokes of that rusty red color really help you to see maybe my vision of where I could see the path. Also, as everything is starting to dry, you will get a sense for when you can add more layers to even those background trees, because that background layer is still not fully dry. So I can still add some misty trees in the background, but they won't diffuse as much. So it's a great way to continue to add more depth as you notice your paper starts to dry. And now I'm just going to continue to add details, to continue to define the pathway, to add texture, to add contrast. A lot of the time when I see people who are struggling to paint, or they feel like their painting is really flat, it's because they haven't added contrast in some way. Contrast can be the darkness of a color, or even the texture of color next to something that is a little bit more smooth. One of my favorite tricks, I didn't list this in the materials, but if you have an old credit card lying around, you can use the edge of a credit card to scrape in textures in rocks, grass. It's kind of the same thing as using the other end of your brush, except when you use a card, it takes some of the paint away instead of having a divot for the paint to go into. So you can see it worked the best in the back where it was still a lot more wet, but I made some swipes for tree trunks and they almost look like white trunks or like a highlight of a trunk. Anyway, I loved the addition of the texture with the credit card. That was a Fat Cats card, but you might not have that where you are. It's like a gaming arcade here in Arizona. Another tip that I have for spontaneous landscapes that can actually apply to most landscapes is to not focus on perfection or single blades of grass or singular rocks, but focus on the colors and the feeling and the shapes. So leaving some areas that are light, leaving some areas that have nothing in them, complete white space, making sure that you have smooth and textured areas next to each other, combined with each other, blended together. Those kind of things will make your landscapes dynamic, spontaneous or not, and will make them feel like you can see what's going on in the landscape, even if you're painting in this more loose, abstract style. You don't have to paint every single blade of grass. When I was teaching the workshop in Croatia a couple of weeks ago, we talked about setting a 15-minute timer for yourself and painting something from beginning to end, like a fully completed landscape in 15 minutes. So what this does is it helps our brains to stop focusing on all of the details and really try to focus on blending, colors, contrast, and shapes. And when you know you're limited in time, you stop focusing on everything that really doesn't matter and that actually makes your paintings look overworked. So I painted this painting in under 15 minutes, and I hope that you also maybe take this challenge as well, because spontaneous landscapes are a perfect way to practice not overthinking and letting the water and the paint do their thing, and then just defining some of the details so you have a focal point without worrying about every single detail of your painting. So now you can see that as the painting is pretty much dry, I can add more and more details with greater increase in contrast and saturation of the paint, and the painting begins to pop even more. And again, I need a shirt or something that says this, but we need our light values, our medium values, and our dark values. Once we have all three, we know that we are done with our painting. So we're starting to get that feeling of like, okay, I'm almost done, because I can sense that I've got a lot of really good contrast, and the main focus, which is this path, is very defined. So I'm putting in the small details. I'm adding texture to the path. I'm adding some rocks to the side that are in kind of a bluish color to help balance it out. I'm really defining some of the edges of the path with tiny little paint strokes so that it's very clear to see. Now that the trees in the back are fully dried, I can go in with kind of a dry, thick brush with thick paint and make some really scraggly, sparse looking leaves by just kind of tapping lightly onto some of those tree branches that we made. Because some of those tree branches we made with the other end of our brush, they kind of went up into the sky. So now we can add some of those textures very clearly in more of the hard lines now that everything is dry. Also, now that everything is dry, we can go in and add some more orange detail. Orange is such a bright color that if we add too much orange while everything is still wet, it will bleed out and get muddy and not stay bright. So it's fun to go back and add some of those brighter details, especially with a beautiful color like orange. It really makes all of those fall colors that we wanted to include pop. At this point I'm almost done, but I felt like the landscape needed a little bit of texture along the bottom, so with that muted orange color still on my brush, I made some dotted shapes that kind of reminded me of stones or pebbles, and then I used clean water to soften some of the edges just because I didn't want them to look too harsh, and I felt like that looked really nice along the bottom. It really balanced out how much texture is going on along the top of the painting. And then I picked up some indigo for one more final giant blob of contrast because I felt like it looked a little odd right there. And this spontaneous landscape is finished. Thank you all so much for being here with me today while I painted this spontaneous landscape. I hope you were able to take a lot of the tips and techniques we talked about in this video and take them into your own spontaneous landscape practice. Remember to set a 15-minute timer to let loose and let the watercolor and paint really paint the painting for you. I'll see you all next time. Bye.